Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for coming tonight. I would now like to introduce the Dean of the University of Sydney School of Architecture, Design and Planning, Professor John Redmond.
Welcome. And before we commence tonight's proceedings, I'd like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It is upon their ancestral lands that the University of Sydney is built. As we share our knowledge, teaching, learning and research within the university and the insight in the talk tonight, may we also pay respect to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of country. Now, on behalf of the University of Sydney School of Architecture, Design and Planning, I'd like to welcome you to the university for the 2017 Droga Architect in Residence Lecture by Dr. Alberto Pérez-Gómez. But firstly, I would like to thank Daniel and Linda Droga for their extraordinary philanthropy in making the AIA Droga Residence Program possible. And secondly, I'd like to thank the AIA and its jury committee for choosing a person of Dr. Pérez-Gómez's standing. It'd be very easy for a professional institute to choose a star of architectural practice for this program. Instead, they have chosen a very distinguished theorist whose work has major implications for an impact on professional practice. I think that's a very good symbol of the way that the Institute has always been concerned for the development of the discipline of architecture as well as for the development of its professional practice. Please join me in welcoming Professor Anthony Burke, Jury Committee Member for the Droga Architect in Residence Program, who will introduce our distinguished speaker. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Professor Redmond, for that fabulous introduction. I can only agree with your words about the value of having people like Alberto join us as part of the mandate and the cause for the foundation to exist in the first place, and his contribution to practice and theory and academia is one of those unique offerings that someone like Alberto is uniquely able to offer us. So good evening, and on behalf of the Australian Institute of Architects Foundation, welcome to today's lecture by Dr. Alberto Pérez-Gómez. It's my pleasure to introduce Alberto this evening, but first, the Droga Residency Program is the first major project for the foundation, and Alberto is our 7th architect to be selected by a distinguished jury following a worldwide call-out. The residency program is unique to Australia and reflects the aims of the foundation, which is about the exchange of international collaboration and ideas, education and awareness, appreciation, involvement in architecture and design for the benefit of the entire Australian architectural community. Each residency program is unique, which is also quite a challenge for all of us and quite a delight for all of us, and curated according to the work of the visiting architect. This evening's lecture is the 3rd in a series of 6 national lectures, which Alberto is presenting in public venues across Australia, and I just thought I'd read the titles of the other lectures. Architecture as a Performing Art, Architecture as Urban Space, the Place of Participation, which is what we will hear this evening, Place and Architectural Space, The Problem of Context in Contemporary Architecture, On Beauty and Justice in Architecture, Attunement, Architecture After the Crisis of Modern Science. So as you can see from those 6 topics, there is both a very delightful consistency to the thinking that Alberto brings to his lecture series and also a diversity in ways to reflect upon the topic of, I think, really what amounts to how do we understand architecture's agency and advocacy in a world gone crazy with neoliberal ideology, when things like beauty and trust and compassion, those things perhaps which are values which drive architecture, need to be thought of anew and afresh in our current context. I've been asked now to say some gracious words about Alberto. That's not very hard because Alberto is an absolutely delightful person personally to spend any time with, and if you have any inkling at all to be able to spend some time with Alberto while he's here for the next 6 weeks, I think it is, there is nothing more delightful than to stroll around Sydney's streets with Alberto and hear him just have a conversation about what we're walking through at the time. Alberto, as you know, has a long and very distinguished academic record. Is the Sade Rosner Brofman Professor of the History of Architecture at the School of Architecture at McGill, where he calls home. I did think it was interesting to note that Alberto's first MA thesis was titled "The Concept of Space as an Essential Element in Architecture," and then his doctoral PhD was "The Use of Geometry and Number in Architectural Theory, from Symbols of Reconciliation to Instruments of Technological Domination." That was some time ago. And since then, Alberto has delighted us with books, really bringing us all, I fondly remember bringing us all into the world of phenomenology and its impact on our thinking in architecture, and most recently, writing about attunement and architectural meaning after the crisis of modern science. The Droga Residency is managed by the Foundation and supported by fundraising initiatives, including donations by individual patrons. As a charity organisation with tax-deductible status, we welcome your support. Please find a way to give generously and support this wonderful endeavour. Following the lecture, we will have a quick rejoinder from Professor Michael Tawa, and then a little chat before wrapping up for this evening. So welcome everybody to this wonderful lecture, and especially welcome Dr. Alberto Pérez-Gómez.
Hi, good evening, and thank you very much for joining us here. I'm very grateful to our hosts, to the sponsors of the program that have made this possible. I'll stick to my text because we have strict time limitations. But as Anthony pointed out, I'm here for another 3 or 4 weeks. I'm delighted to talk to you in more informal circumstances. If you care to be in touch, I'll be delighted to see you. So I want to talk about the connection between architecture and the city and how architecture might contribute to the city. I think the architectural profession has struggled, it's not recent, for over 2 centuries, in fact, to define its potential contributions to modern culture through its primary, what I think it's a primary urban vocation. I mean, only 3 weeks ago, here in Sydney, one of the first things that I attended were some sessions at the big AIA conference. I happened to be present in a session where some colleagues, planners mostly, a few architects, but mostly very intelligent planners, were discussing the problem of the megalopolis, you know, these huge cities that seem to be imminent. And when asked at the end of the session what role they saw architecture might play, 2 of them absolutely unequivocally said, none whatsoever. Nobody said anything, you know, I cringed, and, well, I mean, it's not my place to scream, but I was actually very worried. But this gives you, of course, I mean, you know, an architect, I mean, there was some kind of curious response from someone from the city, not really answering to this question. But I think one of the problems is we fail to understand what architecture, what is possible for architecture to contribute. We actually, ourselves, sometimes fail to grasp this. In an important book titled The Fall of Public Man, written in the 1970s, Richard Sennett explained the changes in the valorization of public space that took place between the European 18th and 19th century. So he compares the 18th to the 19th century in order to understand what actually changed. These changes eventually affected the whole of the Western world, and in some ways are now taken for granted in our technological world village. It is therefore, I think, quite important to reflect upon them. And this is a book that is often read in architecture schools, but not always. Some of you may know it. Succinctly, Sennett describes how the inhabitants in the large 18th century European cities, specifically Paris and London, still understood the primary importance of the public realm for their personal lives. A public realm which was then literally identified with the space of the theater, where all significant actions took place. Human meanings had been associated with political and religious rituals throughout the centuries. Forever, right? I cannot make a detailed story of that. And during the 18th century, this dimension was preserved, at least partially, through theatrical convention. Such conventions allowed for individuals to participate in public life, still understood as primary for one's self-understanding. One could, for example, speak one's mind about the king or the ministers in a cafe, while respect was still expected, of course, in other places. One could converse freely with an unknown lady in a park, for instance, but without expecting to be able to accompany her back home. One's dress represented status, just as architectural character theory, expressed in the treatises of the time, demanded that houses be designed in accordance to the owner's role in society. Such a mentality reflected directly on architecture and urban design. Urban historians have typically stressed the theatrical qualities of 18th century cities. And it is easy to identify a clear intentionality on the part of architects to conceive of urban spaces as theatrical environments. Theaters themselves, for example, in the well-known examples of the Galli-Bibbiena family of architects and stage designers, express continuity between the perspective spaces designed for the stage, perspectival, right, for the play, and the space of the amphitheater itself, characterized, as you can see in the slide, as a kind of urban edge condition. Inside the theater, some of you may be surprised to know, the lights never went out. Of course, candlelight, right? Every theatrical performance was like a celebration, still a ritual that unified the body politic. Everyone spoke and commented, and even addressed the actors, showing pleasure or displeasure at their performances. The actors, on the other hand, did not dress in historically accurate costumes, like, say, Julius Caesar would dress in a Roman toga, but in contemporary clothes, you know, like I'm dressing and you are dressed. And the prime side where an individual might be recognized or repudiated by others in society was precisely in the context of a theatrical function. Like, I don't know if you know this, the ending of Dangerous Liaison by Duclos. It's a famous novel that have been transferred into film in several versions. You know, this woman is kind of a bad person, a libertine, and it is really in the theater that everybody turns their back to her. She's out of society, right? So this theatricality of public life is extremely explicit. In sharp contrast, it's really very sharp, the difference. After the French Revolution, I mean, you know, because this is really what is happening, right? The end of the so-called Ancien Régime, a whole understanding of politics that you know, went back centuries and centuries, even millennia, right? The idea that the political figurehead had a kind of transcendental connection to something other, to God. When that ends, something very radical changes in our understanding of the city. So this becomes clear in the 19th century, where private space and the expression of private feeling is what are generally valorized by societies. An authentic individual, ever since then, is one that expresses her or his feelings, not a conventional facade for public interaction. The theater is no longer an analogy to city life, but becomes rather a simulacrum on stage. The lights go out, and we assist there to be mostly entertained, like we go to the movies today, right? A good example of this early situation, you know, when this starts to happen very clearly, there are other earlier examples, but a good example of this is the famous Bayreuth Festspielhaus, designed for Wagner's operas. Stage sets and costumes become realistic, and the lights go out. Any potential knowledge afforded by the spectacle takes place at a distance, spectators are literally apart from the stage. And all of us that go there as spectators are expected to be disciplined, like you are tonight. You are really very good, very disciplined. You are used to this. Silence, perfect attention, right? Total concentration. Whether we attend a concert, an opera, or a play. You know, the story of concert music. You are used to that now, right? We go to the Sydney Opera House and we get very disturbed if someone is opening their chips behind us, right? Their bug or their candy. You know, which is kind of, if you compare to the way that music was always functional and has to do with space and with and was really a party, right? In the 18th century, it's a real change, concert music, right? Now we're used to it, but it's quite a discipline. These changes are concurrent with the emergence of the new democratic individual, endowed at birth with human rights and driven actually by the pursuit of pleasure. These transformations are too complex to describe in more detail here tonight, but their consequences in all dimensions of life were enormous. There emerged a distrust about the value of public participation, or rather its substitution for a new disembodied commercial and voyeuristic activity, is still today characterizing what we normally do in the city. Such transformations in societal priorities have had a profound and disorienting impact on architecture. A dramatic consequence, easy to appreciate by all of you here, because I know most of you are architects, is our unprecedented acceptance of the private home as pertinent, sometimes even central, to architectural expertise. The problem, and you know sometimes, and we don't normally talk about it, we take it for granted, right? But it's a big deal if you think about the problem in the longer tradition of our discipline. The problem has become only more difficult since cities have increasingly proliferated everywhere on our planet, often hostile and unmanageable entities. Yet today, they have become the privileged habitat for over half of humanity. It is understandable that the practical problems of providing sustainable housing and infrastructure for billions of people dominate the agenda, often clouding issues of well-being and, I would say, cultural sanity. Still conceptualized by planners as efficient, functionalized systems of circulation and consumption, very few of us have the courage to question that. The contemporary metropolis is often polarized between the traditional aspirations of urbanity and the early modern dreams of suburbia. Even a cursory historical knowledge reveals that the primary function of pre-19th century architecture was to open up communicative spaces for focal actions, disclosing a political, social, or mythological order to a community, making therefore a good life possible, a wholesome life, both healthy for the body and for the mind, spiritually. It has not been, as it is often assumed, to design aesthetic objects for clients. While the definition of architecture has shifted historically, I would like to argue in this lecture that its main interests have always related to the configuration of meaningful, resonant public space, that its forms of production have traditionally gone far beyond buildings to include interventions such as ephemeral structures, for instance, that we today associate with other artistic disciplines and alternative practices. And that this is a crucial issue as we must account for transitional forms of dwelling in the contemporary metropolis, where building is driven by capitalist greed, crisscrossed by local interests, and the so-called motorways of telecommunications. Indeed, the central traditional concern of architecture has been the disclosure of social and political order from human experience. Starting from the perceptions of meaning particular to each of our world cultures, embodied in stories, habits, and physical traces, while projecting imaginative alternatives that enrich life and values. Arguably, today, good architecture may even propose alternatives beyond stifling and repressive inherited institutions. Thus, in the best cases, architecture has provided spaces of encounter and participation where the other, is recognized and respected, spaces that enable human freedom, often, seemingly paradoxically, by revealing the very limits associated with our mortal existence, a silence that underscores all human actions. This intersubjective and emotional space of face-to-face communication is crucial for human self-understanding. It is not the same as communicating through the cell phone. And it is always, like the Greeks used to say, bittersweet. It's not always about pleasure. In recent times, however, the very possibility of such a public realm in the contemporary metropolis has been disputed. Some have even argued that telecommunications have taken its place. Many cultural critics, even celebrated architects like Rem Koolhaas, write skeptically about the possible existence of public space in any form that remotely resembles its traditional incarnations, a suspicion often vindicated by the interest of modern consumer societies. Such critics believe it is futile to question commercial and economic interests, preaching that it is simply better to play the game and go with the flow. While granted that talented architects such as Koolhaas sometimes have the good judgment of not believing themselves their cynical pronouncements and produce work that enriches programmatic or urban experiences, such as there, right, in the Casa de Música in Porto. I think that's an interesting project in this regard. Such statements are profoundly problematic. It is because intentionality is very important for architects. We really have to know what we are intending to do. It is important to clarify how the proper vocation of architecture is indeed the configuration of public space, meaning specifically a poetic proposition disclosing collective order, one that intentionally embraces fictions to open us to human meaning. Obviously, the operation invoked here is hardly analogous to the now fashionable and celebrated definition of design by Bruce Mao, understood as clever or aesthetically pleasing planning, an activity which is increasingly associated with other human endeavors. Architecture is not reducible to such definition, even if we can admire its accomplishment in seductive or sustainable objects. While it could be argued that the privatizing tendencies of modern societies remain on the rise, and that individuals in the industrialized and developing world are suspicious about symbolic space, usually associated with repressive political or economic forces, it is also true that our sense of radical homelessness encourages dangerous pathologies. We interact more with machines than with other human beings, and this results in narcissism, alienation, and the incapacity to grasp a sense of purpose for our actions. This sometimes translates, in our epoch of incomplete nihilism, into violent expressions of nationalism and fanaticism. In other words, while it is healthy to recognize the fallacies of ethnocentric nationalism, and we may increasingly feel comfortable with the idea of planetary citizenship, we also know that qualitative places are a constitutive dimension of our consciousness. We need to feel at home, and this need for dwelling is always a living with others. This is a fundamental characteristic of the human condition that cannot be reduced to a private, perfectly serviced cubicle, as eloquently demonstrated in the precious and now classic science fiction novella of E.M. Forster. I really recommend it to you. It's very, very easy to read. It takes about an hour and a half. The Machine Stops. And more recently, in the remarkable novel by Michel Houellebecq, The Possibility of an Island. Fiction has this capacity, to reveal things that sometimes we don't see very clearly. And these novels are very good at that. What happens if we really fulfill our dream of reducing communication to a screen? What actually happens to humanity? Right? I'm not going to tell you. It's impossible for me to tell you. You should read these writers. The functioning power of public spaces as a site for intersubjective meaning started to deteriorate after the closure of what Michel Foucault called the age of representation at the end of the European 18th century. Understanding the problem in a longer historical perspective is important to help us contemplate possible alternatives in the age of telecommunications. While we cannot conceive of public space as simply a designated area in the city, no matter how formally appealing, I believe our cultural heritage still offers alternatives distinct from the flat space of the computer screen. Using the ancient Greek city, the democratic polis, as a point of departure, public space was famously defined by Hannah Arendt as the space of appearance. It is the site where I find myself and recognize my place through the presence of the other. In the case of the Greek polis, by acting with others through speech, qualified by Aristotle as praxis, we sometimes misunderstandingly translate praxis as practice. You know, Aristotle understood praxis as like the things we do with our hands is techne, right? But praxis is speech. Despite the historical difference that separates us from ancient Greece, we can recognize that public space is a space of full embodiment, a space of dialogue, gesture, and erotic exchange. Philosophers like Maurice Merleau-Ponty and Nick Crossley have demonstrated the error involved in conceiving the human mind as monadic, as a kind of inner phenomenon. Each individual's consciousness appears by virtue of the others. It is as much in the world as in our individual brains. In other words, the social body is primary. It is fundamentally situated, bound by the temporality of experience, the very offering of architecture, capable of conveying a mood, Stimmung, resonance, or attunement. In the classical and Christian worlds, this experience was generally described as harmony, the well-known central value of architectural theories from Vitruvius to the end of the Enlightenment. Public space is thus ultimately irreducible to the geometric space of architectural design, regardless of its form of representation, whether on paper or on a computer screen. The communion it enables is also irreducible to other forms of communication, regardless of the technology we may invoke, from printing to hypertext. Like orality with respect to written language, this embodied communication is always antecedent. You know, it has priority over other kinds of information conveyance. In the Western tradition, public space, urban space, was also political space. As opposed to so-called cyberspace, it is a space with boundaries. In fact, it is the space where the horizon may and must become visible, our inescapable mortality. Its reality was traditionally made possible by the inner workings of a culture and its rituals. Ever since the late 18th century, as I have suggested already, cities stopped being articulations of ritual places and became mere circulation. I mean, one of the earliest demonstrations of this is in the treatise of Pierre Pat from 1770, who draws this section of the street and imagines really the city as a circulation of fluids, of people, of traffic. You know, it's a completely different concept. Always a pre-planned destination, this, for the circulation of people and goods, always with a pre-planned destination in order to be significant. And now served, of course, by our GPS systems that never allow us to be lost. This contributed greatly to the loss of qualities in urban spaces. Ivan Illich explains, for example, how smell was evacuated from places by the new concern for hygiene, which is really very much what drives this business of circulation, right? Circulation of air or sewage. So basically it evacuates both the sweet smell of baking bread and the memory of death. As cemeteries were removed from their old locations inside the city, sometimes in the middle of the city, or by the churches, and relocated in the periphery. You know, it's a fascinating thing to imagine when we talk about the qualities of space, what smell contributes. The moment that you evacuate smell, it becomes easier to believe that we live in a kind of isotropic, geometric, Cartesian space rather than in places, right? But this is something that, you know, it's very obvious. And it also happens at this point in history, you know, from the 18th to the 19th century. The master metaphor for 200 years now, more or less 200, has indeed been circulatory. Efficiency in this regard seems to be all that truly matters. I mean, I've been walking all over in, I cannot talk too much extemporaneously, but I've been walking all over in Sydney, and one thing that has really impressed me is how cars have priority here. You know, if you walked in other places here really, traffic has priority. You know, it's very, I move, because I walk a lot everywhere where I go, and there's nothing wrong with this. You know, the pedestrian is very well protected, the traffic lights work very well. But clearly, what really matters here is that traffic that comes from all sorts of directions keeps moving, right? In the place I call home, for instance, if the car is turning and you cross, you have priority. At least you have this ownership over the city, right? Here, it's not sure, right? You have to. Anyhow, so it's curious, you know. I mean, I know that there are priorities, but this is, for me, it's been something striking. And yet we remain fundamentally embodied consciousness, and we are lost and incomplete when it comes to our true purpose, regardless of what we do or how much money we make. This is our true nature. Our mindfulness is not computer memory, and we are not Cartesian points in the ether of communications. I would like to argue that an obvious point of departure to reclaim spaces as poetic events in the contemporary metropolis is to challenge that dominant concept. This is, of course, very simple to state here. You know, I'm very safe here. But I know that it's incredibly difficult to accomplish. Carries incredible economic and practical implications. And the manifestation of this challenge in architecture and urban design projects will always be difficult and case-specific. Put very simply, we are in fact not merely voyeurs perceiving the city, mostly as visual phantasmagoria, through autonomous senses sending data to the brain, as was famously claimed for the 19th century flaneur. Rather than experiencing cities by circulating, usually today in some sort of vehicle, it is indeed rather crucial to walk and linger and to engage in focal actions while recognizing our place in the labyrinth and our openness to desire. Cities must start by being places where one can experience reality synesthetically. That is, privileging an embodied multisensory consciousness that may remind us how reality is not reducible to sense-specific information. This will be another whole lecture as well, you know, but I won't get into that here. But this is a fact that we know now. Early 20th century European novels, such as those in the screen, but there are others, such as James Joyce Ulysses, Andre Bailey Petersburg, and Virginia Woolf, Mrs. Dalloway, Philippe Soupeau, Last Night in Paris, and Louis Aragon, Paris Peasant, just to mention a few, vividly demonstrate how cities play such a role as sites of embodied emotional cognition. They become, how can I put it to you? If you look at these novels, the cities become characters in the plot. And it really has to do, it's curious, but it all has to do with walking the city. Huh? Fascinating. Something so simple. This awareness is paramount in our design interventions. Human perception of meanings is enactive, not passive like digestion. And it happens in pure presence. It is not merely the result of an addition of sense-specific sensations connecting to a computing mind. Allow me to examine this historical narrative a little bit in more detail, you know, how public urban space in Western architecture has worked. We may identify here, for the sake of our argument, two major traditions, resonant with the theoretical philosophy of Aristotle. One of these traditions celebrated the indicative uses of language, endeavoring to name things clearly. The Agora, you probably know, you may have been there, but you certainly recognize the place. This is, of course, Athens, was the specific place for public speech and debate of political issues by citizens. It was also the space for commerce and communication. The Greeks understood well the persuasive power of spoken language, a motor of political action. Rhetoric, that is to say, to be able to speak well, was identified with both the possibility of foregrounding the truth through well-crafted speech, while also was recognized as dangerous because it could be deceptive. Describing at the outset of his first book, The Possibilities of Architectural Meaning, Vitruvius analogously insisted that the semantics of signifier and signified were at work in architecture, implying that buildings signify the order of the universe, an assumption accepted in some measure by all his successors, at least until the late 17th century. Even during the following century, that is to say the 18th, Enlightenment theorists employed linguistic analogies to account for the problem of meaning, originating no longer in nature, but in the cultural conventions inscribed in history. One of the outcomes was the character theory that related buildings to the status of clients, as I have mentioned a little bit before. While traditional cosmic and linguistic analogies always allowed for the possibility of poetic expression, the semantic model became reduced to indicative meanings in the semiotic architectural theories of the 1960s. Electronically enabled public spaces in the web offer today opportunities for communication that have been praised as the new truly public forum. Indeed, you know, the forum is the Latin equivalent of the agora. Indeed, they seem to enable communities of like-minded people to debate, participate, and find a voice in their respective political constellations. And yet, as we have observed above, it is important not to simply assume that information transmittal is equivalent to real, embodied, gestural communication. The distortions that can occur under such assumptions are already self-evident. Just look at the problem with Trump and the tweeting business, right? The internet creates as much opacity as it does transparency. Our Greek cultural ancestors, however, also valorized poetic language, not only indicative language, poetic language, the language of fiction, which Aristotle believed to be superior, actually, to the indicative language of history. Superior, better, in its evident capacity to reveal important, orientating truths around human affairs, disclosing phronesis, wisdom, as opposed to theoretical truths or episteme. This led to the instauration of an alternative tradition of public space that is highly evocative for present possibilities, and that has already been mentioned in this lecture. They associated this alternative public space with the theater and our encounter with arts and poetry, a mediated public realm that celebrated not clear information, but poetic utterance, speaking to all our senses beyond denotative signification, opening the word to its limits in the artistic event of the tragedy, right? The triune chorea, which involved not only the word, but dance, poetry, music, rhythm. It was like opera, right? All together. You were moved here, not only here, right? Like you are moved today by music. If you go to a great concert, right? This is where you feel it. That this revelation took place in a clearing made possible by architecture. Of course, the hora, right? I mean, it's almost a diagram that is crystallized in the theater. Interestingly, Vitruvius recognized the theater as perhaps the most important of all urban institutions, analogous to his own description of the origins of architecture in the opening paragraphs of his second book, where such origin as a clearing in the forest makes possible language and culture, and is the beginning of architecture. The space of architecture is suggested by necessity, according to Vitruvius, by the possibility of maintaining a fire that was initiated by branches of trees that were rubbing against each other during a storm. So it caught fire, and then the primitive humans learned to keep it going. So a technique emerges with culture. The domestication of fire brings men together. They recognize the other, begin to speak, and eventually they build. Everything happens together. It's very insightful, actually. This emerging language, in continuity with gesture, is poetic. The nature of all human natural languages, what we speak in everyday life. Indeed, according to philosophers like Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty, this is the original human speech, inevitably polysemic. That is to say, it's completely other than denotative. You know, it has always plural meanings. The poignancy of this story cannot be overemphasized. First of all, the fire is not stolen from the gods, like in the case of Prometheus. It is a gift, a heavenly spark generated by the wind, still perceived by Vitruvius as the breath of nature, an invisible force that lights up human desire in our hearts and is responsible for our health and well-being. Appropriated by the first humans, a clearing opens up, a place for dwelling. Architecture is poetic, yet coincidental with the origins of language and culture. Its primary role is not to build shelters, but to reveal limits that make sense, to make possible situations in space and time where we understand ourselves through others, a communicative space for our social being. In some of my writings, I have elaborated on the famous neologism Plato uses to describe space in his Timaeus. He associates hora with both the primordial space of the womb and the primordial seminal substance, you know, the kind of masculine semen, while designating it as the third element of reality, other than being and becoming, one that allows the mysterious intertwining of these two, of being and becoming, ideas and their embodiment in the actual things as we experience reality in our cultural space, so that I can recognize this as a glass. Is this specific glass, and it's also the ideal glass. And this happens in my experience. This is what phenomenology reveals. Meaning is there in experience. I don't make it up. You know, it's both the ideal and the specific at once. This is hora, and this is also architectural space, as opposed to topos, which is natural space. So for Plato, hora, and by the way, this is a few centuries later, Euclid would use the same word, horion, to describe that place out there which is bound through some kind of geometry, which is what architects do, right? Horion, hora, okay. Plato's, Euclid's word. For Plato, hora is thus distinct from topos, as I said, or natural space. In connection to my present argument, allow me to point out the fact that Plato's term is cognate to both the central space of the dance, right? That in the middle, right? The chorus, yeah, that. And also, the word is used to designate the region of a city, beyond its physical limits, as in choreography. The word for a regional map, choreography. This, I would argue, challenges simplistic distinctions between urban and suburban space, and invites meditation on the nature of the cultural space of the metropolis. I mean, it's interesting because the Greek city, the boundaries, some of these cities had walls, but the boundaries were actually invisible, they were outside. Had to do with the network of temples that were outside of the walls, right? So it's not that simple to say that simply the wall is the boundary. It's a region, which is a space for human habitation, right? It's a cultural space as opposed to natural space. In the Greek theater, a catharsis took place, says Aristotle, a purification that allowed each citizen to discover a sense of purpose and belonging, the sense and mystery of uncertain human fate as reconciled with our capacity for rational understanding of our place in a cosmic and a political order. You know, the political aspect of the theater was also very important. All the tribes of Athens sat in different places in the case of the Dionysian festival, for example, in that city. I would contend that what is crucial here is the imperative of participation. What we call today interaction or interface in digital simulacra and installations is not necessarily participation. Participation presumes the priority of aesthesis in the original ancient Greek sense, a mode of knowing that is embodied and emotional, as opposed to intellectual or theoretical, totally at odds with so-called aesthetic judgment, which is often assumed to be the result of contemporary and dramatic practices. Understood in this manner, intertwining feeling and linguistic awareness, true aesthetic knowledge is both embodied and in place, and can never be reduced to intellectual judgment. Following upon theatrical traditions, upon this theatrical tradition, European architects often designed ephemeral structures for specific events that had the effect of transforming the citizens' understanding of place. We have examples from the Middle Ages, such as the so-called mystery plays, usually enacted during Christmas and Easter, whose organization in the cities recalled the original geometric order of the Roman foundations, you know, the north, south, east, west, cardos, and decumans, and were superimposed on the more random urban order of towns, and told the stories appropriate to the occasions, Christmas and Easter, of course, to participating citizens. During the Renaissance, architects like Palladio spent months designing ephemeral structures, often to signal the changing political alliance for a city or their birth or death or marriage of a sovereign, realigning the citizens with political or religious orders. So this created memories, right? Even though the architecture was not permanent, like this building, the memory was permanent. Yes? This is very important to realize, yes, that this is really what matters, this because of this question of participation. This tradition continued unabated into the 18th century. Here's a remarkable example from Paris, a design from the mid-18th century by Giovanni Niccolò Servandoni with the Pont Neuf in the background of an event to celebrate the birth of the Crown Prince. All these events, framed by an architecture of canvas and wood, revealed cities in unexpected ways and created lasting memories, ultimately attuned events that motivated participation and solidarity, revealing a sense of the world. Let me then go back, because we are soon to conclude now, to the initial question. Is it possible, despite our distance from classical and pre-modern cultures, to imagine this model of architecture as event, as a framework to configure potential urban space in our cities? Despite our radical skepticism and our lack of shared beliefs and rituals, is it possible to imagine that such experiences may indeed bring us back to introspection, allow us to ask important human questions, and even change our orientation in life? Philosophers Hubert Dreyfus and Sean Kelly have recently argued in the affirmative. In a book where they consider the possibilities of a non-theistic perception of meaning in the classics of Western literature, an appreciation shared by George Steiner and Mark Johnson for other artistic disciplines. This book actually became quite a bestseller, even though it's philosophy. You know, it's rather remarkable if you want to look at it. I think it's a very interesting read. Dreyfus and Kelly further argue that this perception of things shining depends on the acknowledgement of what matters to us, that what matters to us is always part of larger meanings that we do not create or control through our free will. Thus, they speculate such experiences may still be available to us in communal activities, such as some forms of participatory contemporary theater, ephemeral urban events, and even popular sports spectacle. You know, remember how sports polarize people. You know, people become transfigured, right, by the sport events. Furthermore, as we walk through the prosaic and relatively inhuman spaces of our cities, there are sites that have a greater potential to escape the hegemony of panoptic domination and technological control. We have to become sensitive to this. They are found by framing the city through appropriate questions, by means of perhaps what I would call alternative mappings that have nothing to do with Cartesian cartography or geometric precision. You know, there is a nice work on mapping by philosopher of place Edward Casey, if you are interested in this. Of course, you know, many examples of these kinds of mappings come from the side of artistic practices. Huh? It's interesting to consider that. They are sites that appear to have been torn from the seeming continuum of progress and that reveal particularly propitious chasms, and wounds. Surrealist writers, I have mentioned a few previously, of the early 20th century, such as Louis Aragon, but I could add here André Breton, taught us very well how to navigate through our seemingly prosaic cities and appreciate their capacity to reveal the vectors of desire. Proposing, if not a new mythology, this is a heavily loaded word that one would have to be very careful with, at least the openness of our world to mystery, our capacity to reveal the weakness of the truths we associate with political systems, with technology and science, and to accelerate their demythification. You know, they are not all that is. I believe it is possible to profit from the opportunities offered by the modern metropolis, to create works that may allow inhabitants to recognize that which is new and yet familiar, that which, although we must receive it in silence, demands to be articulated in words, namely, the coincidence of life and death in a moment of poetic incandescence. This mode of working is, of course, very different from an architect or planner finding a site and merely using it as a neutral canvas, as a geometric or picturesque space. We must seek to touch, to move beyond the merely pictorial, engaging our haptic vision through materiality and appropriate scales to embodied perception and to the rhythms of walking. Potentially participatory places that may be truly pregnant with qualities are not found merely through some sort of passive revelation either. The hermeneutic imagination of the architect is indispensable. I was giving some examples in the previous lecture in Canberra about how Le Corbusier uses this kind of imagination to transform the traces of a monastery, of the Dominican monastery, into something completely other in La Tourette. A park, for instance, is not necessarily meaningful as an atemporal type capable of reconnecting us with nature. It is not enough to find or preserve a site, as merely naming it could accelerate its demise. First, we must understand and acknowledge the importance of history, while recognizing its affinity with fiction, as Jorge Luis Borges has taught us. The stories that make places through words and habits. This is of particular concern for the development of appropriate urban programs. It is paramount to avoid aestheticism, reductive functionalism, and either more conventional or experimental modes of formalism. To consider seriously the potential of narrative as the structure of human life, a poetic vision realized in space-time. The architect, or maybe we can call him the urban artist, given such a task, must also write the script for his drama, intended to become an explicit or implicit transformation of the official urban program. This is indeed, I would say, a crucial part of urban design activity, as well as the vehicle for an ethical intention to inform the work. We should always keep in mind that for modernity, whenever buildings or works of art become idols or signposts, like the logo of a corporation or a national government, they tend to lose their capacity for edification. They should rather allow us to see through to meaning precisely by not restricting it, in themselves meaning no single thing. Only under these conditions may urban interventions become spaces for collective participation, where individuals may exercise with their freedom a reciprocal responsibility to participate in the recreation of a communal project that is no longer dependent on a shared or cosmic order. Such places, moreover, cannot be merely the result of the egocentric imagination of an architect, nor mere novelty, the product of some deranged computer virtuosity. They must refer to the natural and cultural horizons intertwined in their sites. Potentially effective urban space is therefore articulated as narrative, metaphoric projection grounded on recollections. On one hand, it should resist easy consumption and celebrate traces of cultural continuity. On the other, it should invite the inhabitants' intimate participation in recreating the work through language for it to yield its sense. gathering a potential recovery of communal purpose and human solidarity. Richard Sennett has pointed out that spaces come to life when they are used for purposes other than those for which they were conceived. While this is often true, it is important not to misconstrue this statement as a plea for the architect to abdicate responsibility for the program, as is sometimes the case today. Openness is key, but this is precisely the character of works of imagination, open enough to invite participation, but engaging a critical view. In our predicament, this critical attitude must be addressed primarily to the hegemony of a technological world view, particularly in its capitalist versions. I would argue that's where it gets, as you know, most problematic, and its instrumental systems of domination and control, particularly to the paradigm of urban life as mindless circulation, now extrapolated to all aspects of existence. Such critical attitude should weaken the hold of technology on our way of life and reveal the ultimately mysterious horizon of our meaningful experiences. There are alternatives to the voyeuristic reductions of existence present throughout consumer society. Reductions caricatured in extreme, extreme forms of these are like, for instance, theme parks and fenced-in housing communities that really destroy the urban possibilities. Yet, to propose alternative urban spaces, it is perhaps crucial that we as architects first retrieve our capacity to recognize purpose in human works. It's a kind of self-work on ourselves. That we allow our emotional cognition to recognize not deception, but real values in our cultural and artistic heritage, thus healing ourselves from the cynicism and despair brought about by subjectivism and the homogenization of differences, often reflected by post-structuralist criticism. Thank you very much. So, I guess we're doing... How do you want to do this? Should we sit down? Or... You want to talk? Yeah, sorry.
Thank you so much for that. In The Human Condition, Hannah Arendt wrote, "The polis, properly speaking, is not the city-state in its physical location. It is the organization of the people as it arises out of acting and speaking together. And its true space lies between people living together for this purpose, no matter where they happen to be." Alberto, thank you for this rich and provocative survey around the lineage of the city as a theatre of performance and participation. That word, theatre, of course, is from the Greek thea, which means a seeing or a viewing. Hence, the theatre is a place for viewing and for beholding. Our word theory is cognate. It means contemplation and speculation. Literally, it means a way of looking or a world view, a way of framing what comes into sight, what appears. Arendt refers to the polis as a space of appearance, that space where I appear to others as others appear to me, where men exist not merely like other living or inanimate things, but to make their appearance explicitly, a space that must be continually recreated by action and that disappears the moment that these activities cease. And so the city is scenography. The whole scene set by the city is mise en scène and performance. It is instructive to recall that scene, the word scene, is from the Greek skene, which means tent, shade, sky, and shine. And all of these delineate a field on the ground, a shadow, a marked out space that can be for a home or a festival, a ceremony or a ritual. But the scene is also choreography. It is literally space scripting. There is what is seen, and there is the unseen that lies behind the scenes, off screen and out of frame. There is the appearance-disappearance of actor citizens in their comings and goings, in their speech and in their silence. There is then the stage machinery, the infrastructure that makes all of this possible, or at least enactable. And this is maybe Alberto's sense of what architecture might become in its recuperation of itself. The techne, or technology of architecture, the infrastructure that enables and frames the appearance-disappearance of the polity. Alberto has recognized the centrality of fiction to this space of narrative and storytelling, or as we would say here, of yarning, of spinning yarns, of confabulating. Central here is a close connection between language, weaving, and space, between speech, textile, and setting, between story, context, and place, or between fiction, fact, fashioning, and fashion, between fable and fabrication, around this key etymological linguistic root, ba, to speak, to exist, to build, and to dwell. And speaking of yarning, of spinning yarns, there is the yarn we tell, the yarn we use to weave, and the yard that we gather in. All of these cognate terms around the linguistic root ga, gape, yawn, chasm, abyssal gap. This is where both hora and chaos, order and chaos, come from. And the clearing as an evacuated space, but not an empty space, a space that is made ready. And that is the stage as a site of appearance and disappearance. I think Alberto is indicating something interesting about language or speech acts and urban or architectonic acts. For me, this does not point to a denotative, instrumental, descriptive, or representational function of language or indeed of architecture, some kind of plain speak. Rather, it points to a connotative function that comprises analogy, metaphor, and allegory. That is, allos, goros, a speaking otherwise, a speaking of something by speaking of something else, of always sending our speaking elsewhere, of always deferring sense. And this is maybe the pivotal question that Alberto has put to us. What might be the city's role in making this possible, and how does architecture fit into that enterprise? And Alberto says we need to feel at home, and this need for dwelling is always a living with others. Yet in this being at home with others, what does with mean? Originally, with meant against, opposite, contra. More accurately, it meant moving from, toward, or near. That is, to be with is a process of coming into the neighborhood of an encounter. Hence, participation is among the radically separate. It is participation in that radical separateness. It is the appearance of that radical separateness in the public domain. That is, I am with you in my separateness. We are separate together. This is what we share, the radical difference between us. As Alberto says, quoting Nietzsche, is not seeing itself, seeing abysses. And if the business of architecture was to frame an experience of this abyssal condition in the wonder of sharing the radical otherness that we are to each other, in other words, how do we design not something, but the coincident circumstances for an event and the conditions of its emergence? The theatre stage, for example, is actually undesigned in that it is an infrastructure of specific and latent, yet unexercised potential, a network of suitabilities and propensities that are made available for recuperation. How are these propensities unclenched or triggered by the scenographer, the writer, the director, or the actor? And here I diverge from Alberto's line of thinking somewhat. I wonder if it is the architect who will be so central to the enterprise. I wonder if the architect really is the pivot of construing these fables that are to be staged both in and as the future city. Is it not rather a collective enterprise that must script them, a collective of radically disparate singularities? There will have to be historians, technicians, artists, fabricators, poets, novelists, scenographers, choreographers, composers, and yes, architects, but please no curators and no event managers. And won't the transactions between these singularities prove more extraordinary should they flow from what is unknowable between them, that is, in the abysses that separate them?
Thank you, Michael. We've got time just for a very quick little conversation down here, although we are on a clock. So we've heard an enormous amount of material this evening to contemplate around the future of the city and how we should act within it. A lot of it revolving around theatre, scenography, and the central role of discussion as a way of making the city.
Yes.
The discussion point is the maker, if you like, and it happens within the theatre or it happens within the city. I'm going to start with a question to both of you and we'll see how we go. Two philosophers on stage, good luck getting through this in 5 minutes. So I was thinking as both of you were speaking that if the city is a place for discussion as culture, how do we now truly speak up for the city when culture itself has become placeless and disembodied?
Well, I think this is the question of whether culture is placeless. I am not sure that it's ever possible. You know, I think that here the priority of place ontologically is a fundamental question. It would be a very, I think, difficult thing to discuss briefly. But if you want me to refer you to your compatriot Jeff Malpass, I can do that. I certainly believe with him that if you take the Heideggerian understanding of existence seriously, then the place is a condition that precedes, in a way, everything. Which is not to say that we cannot believe that we live in a placeless culture. But this is the challenge, you know. Jeff would say that what happens is that given the conditions that are brought about initially by the scientific revolution, by Descartes, by Galileo, if you want to go to the very origins, but that eventually become commonplace in European cultures, and then they get exported everywhere in the world. What one could say is that places are hiding, but that they are there, and that the role of the architect in this sense would be to disclose the quality of these places.
The architect, but not the event manager.
Not the event manager, but the collective. I mean, the architect obviously has a role because they are part of the intelligence of spatial configuration. But I think Alberto's suggestion of this idea of ephemeral events, if they can be tied to the recuperation of collective memory within a society, and if the public can be brought along to experience that, then there is the beginning of a recovery of something deeper than just wandering through a space. There is a recovery of, let's say, a pre-colonization landscape, an indigenous history of a place with all of its violence and political problems. There is the industrial history of a city. There are, the mapping and so on, cartographically tying that into a choreography of the space. Then space starts to speak. And there are festivals and ceremonies that enable that speaking to become more obvious. I think in a way you're right. There's work to be done in recovering the idea of rituals and ceremonies. What might those be for us today, beyond the established ones of Christianity and so on? I think that requires a collective endeavor. You know?
Yes, I completely agree. You know, in a way, it's funny your conclusion, because for me, the way that the architect has to become relevant is by thinking outside of the box, and precisely because I think what we do is design situations. And therefore, the programmatic dimension of the project, for me, should be crucial. It's not always the case because of the role that we're assigned in society. And that's why, you know, of course, your distinction, your conversation, it makes sense. It's an open question. But I think that if we, as architects, understand the importance of truly grasping the possibilities of what we call program, then maybe we might be in a better situation to enact things like this. And I agree completely. The question of the ephemeral, well, artists understand that very well, you know, better than us, because sometimes we feel that we don't really, that's not our thing. But I guess that's what I was trying to say, that in history, architects always understood that very sharply. Like, they understood that they had to know about fireworks. I mean, you know, there are architects, there are books written by architects about fireworks. You know, that this question of reorienting the collective, the body politic through an ephemeral event is really very important. So that might be one of the possibilities today.
I hear, just I guess in zooming out a little bit, I hear a lot of a call for ambiguity, the possibility of mystery, to bring forth conditions that we can't natively perhaps even forecast ourselves. And I'm hearing a lot of postmodernism in that discussion around theatre and stage making and set making and veneer and promenade and so on. In a modern city like Sydney, that's a pretty hard sell to go out there and use that as a way to bring the city back, if you like, to recover the city.
Yes.
Those are terms that are not going to be, that will not have an audience. How do we work in that context? How do we speak up for the city when the audience is not listening?
I think you do what filmmakers do, is you develop a film that has a clear narrative and a clear story, but you tell other stories at the same time. So you deal with what you need to deal with to get a project moving, but you enrich it, and you don't need to tell everybody everything. But as people experience a film, for example, they can get the story, and if that's all they want, that's fine, but they might also notice that there's something uncanny about that story, and they might begin to wonder about it, and then they might speak to someone else who's had a completely different view, and very quickly that film becomes multiple films. Now, I would see architecture as having that potential. Unfortunately, generally it has a single idea. Normally it's formal, you see it, you forget it. Public space, you know, doesn't have that degree of complexity. Someone hasn't worked on how the very carefully mapping one on top of the other can create situations where that ambiguity starts to become available. But it's not about forcing the ambiguity into people's faces.
Yes.
It's about creating that situation in which it can arise.
Absolutely. No, I completely agree. I think the model of fiction writing, of course, like novels that deal with ways of life that are particular to Australia, particular to Sydney, that have to do with different cultures inhabiting the city, or cinema, or good film. I think it's a good example of how one can actually be touched and transformed by something which is contemporary and which is relevant to the here and now. I don't think that one should just despair and say there is no public. I think the public is there. We all need these moving moments to be able to feel complete in our lives.
Well, as you were actually introducing your lecture, one of the things that I found striking is you made the distinction between those spaces where one could have a conversation with a lady in a park, yes, and not expect to go home with her. There is a space where one can speak freely and where one can speak with respect. I guess that led me to think, do you think we have lost our spaces of respect? I think we have a city of dissent, no problem. There are lots of places where that is happening, online and off. But there's places where respect is actually maintained. They seem a lot rarer these days. Yes. I don't see us designing those spaces.
This is precisely the problem. And we still, this is where the Senate diagnosis is very interesting, because we cannot deny, this is really what you are trying to stress, we cannot deny that this transformation happened in European culture, which is now universalized. But we're still human beings, we still have, you know, we are embodied, we have a synesthetic, haptic capacity to understand the world. We can only thrive in in these spaces of desire that are by definition incomplete, but we're seeking completion, is this question of the bittersweetness of desire. Otherwise, our humanity basically disappears. So we are putting a lot at stake by not acknowledging that this is important. But yes, we're playing with fire, you know. That's why these novels that I was mentioning, particularly Welbeck, who's such a good writer, you know, this French man who wrote this science fiction novel where he imagines a scenario where we can clone ourselves at the height of our energy, and we can live forever, and the whole thing is constructed that way, and then down 20 generations, people communicate through screens, and then something happens. I'm not going to tell you what, right? Someone rediscovers Plato's dialogue on the symposium, right? And everything breaks down, because ultimately it's in the nature of our humanity that we can only understand ourselves in these intersubjective conditions, which is what you were evoking. It's what drove Hannah Arendt to this understanding of the space of appearance. So yes, I mean, you know, there are many difficulties. We live in a society that tends to go the way that you are saying, but we also know that a lot of our psychopathologies are connected to precisely this world that we're making for ourselves. So, and I think that, for better or for worse, I think that it's at least in the architectural tradition where we can best grasp what is possible. Whether it's architects that are actually going to make the difference, I hope so, right? I think we can.
I think that's a beautifully optimistic note to leave
so
this
much.
evening's discussion on. Can I just very quickly thank Dean Redmond for inviting us to have the lecture here this evening at Sydney University, the Architecture Foundation for the residency program and for all the wonderful work it's doing, and to thank you all for coming tonight to listen to our guest, Alberto Pérez-Gómez. Thank you all.
So much. Thank you so much.